first of all, I would like to thank you all to be here, and to thank the French Heritage Society, Elizabeth Scribbling, thank you, and the New York Horticultural Society, Jared Cross is here, thank you very much, and also people from more what we call in a kind of very pretentious way of VIP listing. Thank you very much all for being here. And tonight we're going to hear Antoine Jacobsohn, who's going to talk to us about the King's Kitchen Garden and how much relevant and how much this garden is still a contemporary laboratory for horticultural research. But before, because we here also at Christian Duvernois Landscape, we also are a bit dealing with kitchen garden. So to let you heard a bit about that, I'm going to leave the mic to John Fuscaris.
All right, thank you, Christian. So for those of you who haven't met yet, I'm John Fuscaris, the design director here at Christian Duvernois Landscape. So I just wanted to take about 10 minutes. Thank you all for being here for this talk. Take about 10 minutes to try to run quickly through about 250 years of agricultural history. And please excuse me if I leave something out. Just for some context here. So, the King's Kitchen Garden, or in French it's called Le Potager du Roi, represents a time capsule of culture, gastronomy, and agricultural practices that has survived centuries. As with many royal and elite gardens, it started off as a testament to the status and the power of the king. Of course, his preferred tastes. If the king liked figs, the king got figs. If the king started to like peas, which were at the time maybe poor man's rations, suddenly they became fashionable. So preferences of ruling and elite throughout history have often dictated and enabled diverse collections of produce, which were cultivars sourced from around the world from small-scale growers and urban farms. Across the pond, Thomas Jefferson, the enlightened Thomas Jefferson in the late 1700s at his cherished estates in Monticello, was an avid collector of plants and was actually trading up to 200 types of plants annually with the Jardin des Plantes of Natural History Museum of France, and including such varieties as something called the salsify, whose long roots, he says, when fried in butter, was nearly indistinguishable from fried oysters. And the sweet and delicious sprout kale, a green which survives snow and ice to repeatedly produce edible sprouts throughout the winter. Jefferson himself was quoted as saying, "The greatest service which can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture," 1776. Jefferson, as president of the American Philosophical Society in 1796, he also took very seriously some of the research being done during the Age of Enlightenment. Ben Smith Barton did studies about overpredation of insects and their effects on crops, which led Jefferson to pull into his garden peripheral plantings of trees to attract birds that would then keep those insects in check. But arguably, his greatest source of pride in the orchard were the Taliaferro apple, which he was considered made the best cider, quote, nearer to the silky champagne than any other. He also enjoyed a variety from Queens, New York, a New York City apple, which he wrote back back home in a letter from Paris, not to cause any trouble here in the room, but they have no apples here to compare to our Newtown Pippins. So that's the Enlightenment. To skip ahead, just like I said, to be quick, in history, by the close of the 19th century, we had about 7,000 distinct varieties of apples. in North America being cultivated. 7,000. Apples with distinct tastes, shapes, and colors. This is the Newtown Pippin. That was Jefferson's, one of Jefferson's favorites. Apples that we don't see often today, with red flesh and other flavors. We have the Hunter Spartan. This is a remaining. These are remaining actually. Pink Pearl. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. Hello, everyone. This is the Pink Pearl apple. And look, that is pink flesh. There's a variety. The point is that the genetic reservoirs of apples from that time was much wider because people grew them backyard operations and small farms, and they selected what they thought was good or tasty or attractive. So these are a few just to show of the 7,000. Obviously, I'm not going to show many, but here's a white one called the winter white, and the raspberry ripple, which actually supposedly tastes a little bit like raspberry. So fast forwarding yet another century to be quick, and unfortunately, spoiler alert, Jefferson's prized Taliaferro apple went the way of the dodo, along with almost all of our 7,000 cultivars. By the end of the 20th century, 2/3 of all apple production in America was comprised simply of the cultivars. You should probably recognize these shiny ones in the supermarket: Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, and Granny Smith. And this trend unfortunately continued beyond apples. It's also estimated that about 90% of all fruit and vegetable varieties, the heritage varieties that were grown in the early 20th century by American farmers have vanished by the end of the 20th century. So there was something sharp that happened in the 20th century which kind of shifted our agricultural model. And one major reason for this is commercial production. Commercial production and distribution in North America led to the cultivation of fewer and fewer types of higher yield crops, hybrids. And a lot of the smaller seed farmers kind of left theirs to go into obscurity, and that's how you lose something. And it could be as quick as a generation. And only the cultivars with the longest shelf life, like those apples we saw before, that had minimal bruising and a uniform size and the same harvest time really made the cut from industrial agriculture. And World War II intensified that. After World War II, I should say, as the industrialists sort of pivoted their factory production from war equipment into farm equipment and munitions into fertilizer and toxic chemicals into pesticides and herbicides. So a handful of large corporations have gained an ever greater control of the agricultural model we're in now. And so farming in the 20th century, unlike any time prior in history, has been increasingly occupied by agricultural practices that have no history really or precedent at all, if you look at the course of centuries. And these were touted as wonder drugs, that would replace sort of soil fertility. But a lot of times what we've been noticing in the 20th century is the store-bought produce has become more bland, less nutritious, coated with toxins, and implicated in several things of habitat destruction, pollinator collapse, and other issues which I won't get into because it's Sunday. I don't want to be too depressing. Agrochemical use, what is being remediated now, I should say, and also not to get too technical on a Sunday, but the chemical use affects soil health. And what we're learning now in just the past 2 decades really is the greater and greater importance of soil fertility underground, the exchanges that go on in this underground marketplace between the plant roots and the microbes and microbial life that exist. It's a marketplace which you'll have plant roots they've realized actually secrete something called exudates. And the exudates are a signal that go out into the rest of the soil to attract beneficial bacteria or beneficial fungi, such as mycorrhizal fungi. And these mycorrhizal fungi and beneficial bacteria do things like they increase the plant resistance to pathogens. They increase nutrient uptake and phytochemical production. So this is vital to plant health and their defense. This is what the basis of organic agriculture kind of touches upon. Well, it definitely touches upon, but it's part of a bigger picture. And so harvesting, plants with using their evolutionary symbiosis, which we're starting to really uncover, is something that the 21st century seems to be, gearing up for. So the other thing is, when that happens, we end up with produce which is actually tastier and better for us. That's the other good news. Micronutrients, which are pretty much typically depauperate in conventionally chemical treated soils, are actually able to be synthesized as they should. And although we only need trace elements of it, it's something which causes mineral deficiencies in folks. So this is overall a good thing to go kind of back to the roots, so to speak. The term conventional, I just thought of, it's interesting when you go to the supermarket and you see organic or you see conventional, because conventional is not really that long, it hasn't been conventional for very long. So to moving into 21st century and trying to seek organic agriculture balance and get a little bit blended with our approach. These are nodules, by the way, you see here. These are nodules which actually help leguminous plant attract the right type of bacteria that fix nitrogen in the soil, which is a hard commodity to come by underground. So choosing to eat locally and seasonally is also experiencing a revival. People realize that when you pick something from far away in a distant location, you bring it all the way across from California or whatever, it starts to lose those nutrients at the time of picking. So there's definitely I think the 21st century is starting to see a lot of more local cases. In inner cities especially. So this is an urban lot in Louisville, Kentucky, which was in fact modeled, adapted from the King's Kitchen Garden of Versailles, which you're about to hear about. And this is something we did years ago where the kids would be able to come and actually get their hands dirty in otherwise a food desert to grow their own food and change their eating habits. Once you taste how good a fresh fruit or vegetable is, it really changes someone's mind. And some folks, a handful, can even be changed permanently to the fact that they want to maybe, they get an out from the neighborhood and they want to get into nutrition, or they see something different that they didn't know they might like. So urban agriculture is definitely something I think that in the 21st century needs to be really, really pushed. And adults too, adults alike. So in addition to lots, this is fig trees growing in a small courtyard of brick co-ops right in the West Village. And supposedly when the figs go, there's a mad rush to them. So we got to work out how we ration them out, but that's another topic. This is a rooftop where we actually set up just some industrial chic, planters for folks of all different ages to kind of get in there and plant herbs and fruits. This is now moving into schools. Rooftops are really becoming they're an underutilized space. We're getting better at putting things that weren't on roofs onto roofs, heavy things, wet things, soil. So this is a proposal that for a school in Harlem, which we had done to try and exactly tap into that niche, to give kids a chance to get their hands dirty, to start to learn about where their food comes from, which might be disconnected. And outdoor classrooms, so it's an overall positive. So this again modeled off of the kitchen garden. And this is a private residence, which we did also modeled off the same. And this was this came out a little bright. This is several different raised beds, and this client asked for 0 fertilizer. They want everything organic, and we did that. Low VOC paint, everything. And so there's a beauty to it as well, so besides the productive. And the spirit of the kitchen garden, with all of its gastronomic utility and beauty, has taken on a great deal of relevance, I think, in the 21st century, which brings us back to the King's Kitchen Garden of Versailles and the person you're really here to see. One of the world's oldest and largest continuously cultivated kitchen gardens in the world today. It's still very much a working farm and laboratory for sustainable experimentation. And in a grand way, this site that you're about to hear about really showcases the intrinsic links that exist between culture and agriculture, plant and soil health, and human health, and utility and beauty. These are all alive, well, and continuously explored by our guest speaker, who has served as director of this historic institution for the past 10 years. Prior to that, he was involved in the French National Inventory of Culinary Heritage with a focus on fruits and vegetables, and also was responsible for the Library and Resource Center of the French National Horticultural Society. He's authored and edited several books on the topic of agronomy and the tradition of kitchen gardening, and we're absolutely delighted to have him here in studio today. Without further ado, please join me in giving a warm welcome to, all the way from Paris, France, the director of Le Potager des Rois, Mr. Antoine Jacobsohn.
I don't think I've ever had that kind of introduction before. So, first of all, it's not just me. I have several colleagues with me. There's one in the hallway who's a landscape architect. There's 2 gardeners and 2 students, and I'll be talking about them in just a moment. And then there's this difficult moment of introductions, and I wanted to tell you that the most difficult talk I've ever given was one where my son was present. And I think my second most difficult one is today, because my sister's here. And I'll have to explain that, and I'll have to explain my accent at some point. Because yes, I live in France, but I grew up in New Jersey. It's the Garden State. I'm sorry that New York State doesn't say that yet. So we'll get there. Lots of introductions to be done. I think I'll let you ask questions during or at the end. I'm not going to try to talk too much all the introduction stuff. I'm going to try to get into right away what we're here for, especially since after John's introduction, we could just keep on talking about what he said. There's lots of things in there. This is the first map, the first plan of the kitchen garden. Let's say 1690, the garden is created in 1678. But the most important thing I want to show you is not what's in it, it's the relationship between this image and the next one. How did a kitchen garden become the site for a school of landscape architecture? And how did a landscape architecture school take on the image of a kitchen garden, or the stereotype, the archetype, I don't know how to call that logo, of a kitchen garden in terms of landscape gardening, in terms of landscape planning. And I think that's much of what I'm going to try to talk to you about today. It's this relationship between gardening and landscape, this relationship between gardening and taste, but taste in a very global sense, not taste only in what happens on your tongue or in your nose, taste in terms of something that feels good in your body, feels good for our environment. So let's try to keep on going. And I forget how I organized this. I organized this, I think, in 3 or 4 different parts. We'll start with some history. We'll continue with a whirlwind spring to winter tour, and then we'll try to get a bit details. Whoops, I went too fast, sorry. If you haven't been to Versailles, this is what if you've been to Versailles, this is what you see. And if you haven't been to Versailles, this is also what you see. What I mean by that is people don't spontaneously come to see the kitchen garden. They spontaneously come to see what's in the central space, which is the Galerie des Glaces. And I can't resist to already, this is something that's very common in my family, to put a parenthesis in a parenthesis, to go off on a different tangent, but I can't help it because it's very linked to what I just said. Most people don't know what's happening in this palace. They don't know that when they go from one end to the Galerie des Glaces to the other, they're actually doing how to call this? I've never done this in English. A sort of un trajet initiatique. They're doing a sort of initiation. Because when you go through this gallery, you're going from the north to the south. You're going from la salle de la guerre, you're going from the hall of war to le salon de la guerre, au salon de la paix, to the hall of peace. And you're also going from the north wing, which is the king's wing, to the south wing, which is the queen's wing. And so all the glory of the battles that are on the paintings are not about battles. They're about, supposedly, going from war to peace. I guess it's in part because my sister's here that I got on this sidetrack. It's because what we're trying to go towards is peace, and peace is on the woman's end. And if I go south on this image, which is what I'm going to do, so towards the domestic, towards what's considered female, this is what I see. And you're starting to see a little thing on the left. I'll go back once so you can see it again. There's that square over there. If I go towards it, I start by the orangerie and the pièce d'eau des Suisses, and then I take a left. Whoops, I went backwards. I take a left and I'm over the garden. And the most important thing that I can say now is that it's an urban garden. It wasn't that when it was created, but it has become an urban garden now. We're south of the palace. We're on the side of domestication, the side of the home, the side of peace, the side of culture. The north is about hunting. It's about the wild. Though the kitchen garden is clearly placed on the side of, let's say, homemaking. If I turn around, try to put you back into the palace, that's what you see. Let's try to do some history now. Oh, by the way, whenever I change topics, it's rather simple to know. It's my punctuation. I use that map as my punctuation. So when we get to the end, you'll know when I'm at the end. Louis XIV. Most people think Louis XIV is a person. And yes, he was a man, I admit. But in France in the 17th century, he governs by God's will. So that we can't think, when John says he wants peas, he wants figs, yes, but it's not a man wanting peas or figs. It's the desire of a country. It's what political representation means. And so when he builds Versailles, it's not about a person building his estate. It's about a country representing itself. And that's very important because one never does it alone, one always does it with others. It's always a team. And this is the team he gathered, in particular for the gardens. On the left, Le Nôtre, André Le Nôtre. On the right, a much lesser known person, but just as important, Jean-Baptiste de la Quintinie, the person who does the kitchen garden. But if I reduce him to kitchen gardens, I haven't done him justice. The image just under Jean-Baptiste de la Quintinie is a tree without roots, or rather, a tree without earth on its roots. And actually, that's what he was best known for. He was best known for having created what everybody in the horticultural world knows, which is naked root planting. In other words, in some sense, he's the engineer who allowed Le Nôtre to do how do you say that? Des alignements, long plantations of trees as cheaply as possible. Because you no longer had to bring them all in with the earth. You could bring them in during the winter without earth on the roots and plant them. This image is from the late 18th century. They seem to have a better idea of the relationship between gardeners and landscape architects than many people today. Landscape architects don't function without gardeners. Gardeners are necessary to landscape architects. That's part of our trip that we're having here. I'll talk about that a bit later. This is already a space that both Le Nôtre and La Quintinie are working in. This is Versailles, but you see the Grand Canal hasn't gotten big yet. And if you concentrate on what's on the left-hand side, let me zoom a little bit. It's a painting by someone called Pierre Patel from 1667. So I zoom a little bit towards the left. That square or the thing in the middle is the top of the orangerie. But what I want you to notice is all the water to the left. I want you to notice it because that's very important to where the kitchen garden is going to be. It used to be a swamp. You recognize the square from the orangerie, and you see a garden to the left. That's actually the first kitchen garden. That's the kitchen garden that Louis XIII had. And it's the kitchen garden which La Quintinie starts working in 1662 or 1664. 1664, it's after Vaux-le-Vicomte. So that's what they start with. But then, 10 years later, a little bit more, 14 years later, things get bigger. the palace gets bigger. And if I go back and forth again, let me just do it because you'll see. You have that square. Here, I can do it well. You have the square here. Follow it on the next one because it's going to get big. It's going to get 2. Oh, let me do it again here. You have the square here. Follow it, it's going to double. The orangerie gets much bigger. The kitchen garden leaves and gets put here. So it's no longer here. It gets quite big, 22 acres there. I realized when I was preparing this that I don't show you any other images of the city of Versailles, and I really should, because I'm being too much of a gardener, not enough of a landscape architect. I'll try to talk about it again later. Let's keep going forward, and let's try to go towards the garden, and let's try to think or present to you how Jean-Baptiste de La Quintinie thinks about this garden. So he went from a 4-acre garden to a 22-acre garden. What are the things that are important to him? That's him. I love this image. It's the image that begins the second book of his treatise. And it's actually rather small. The actual image is about a stamp size, or even half the size of a small, I can't talk in English, can I? A small postcard, there we go. It comes out in French. I can do this in French. Anyway, what's strange about, at least I think it's a very beautiful image, but what is it, why am I making you look at it? Can anyone take a guess?
They seem overdressed.
Well, I like that idea. Why would a gardener be underdressed? No, it's something else that's happening in this image that the person up front with should think about because it's linked to you. Someone got it.
What?
He's tasting soil. One person is rubbing dirt, and the other one's tasting it. This is the part of the book about soil. And La Quintinie doesn't say you should eat soil, by the way. He says you should taste it. He says put it in water, shake it up, let it sit, filter, taste. If it's good, your fruit and vegetables will be good. If it doesn't taste good, your fruit and vegetables will not be good. Now you know why I talked about taste before. That's what he's interested in. He's not just interested in making something grow. He's interested in making something grow that tastes right. Lots of images in his book about naked root planting. I wanted to show this one just as another moment. 4 images to try to say that La Quintinie is not only about the king's kitchen garden. He's also working at Sceaux, the first image up here, with avec les châssis and the tiny greenhouses with an orangerie in the back, is at Sceaux for Colbert. Just underneath, for those who don't, so with the building with the dome. Has anyone been to Vaux-le-Vicomte? You've never seen this image at Vaux-le-Vicomte because the kitchen garden's not open. But that's what it looks like when you're in the kitchen garden. So that's Vaux-le-Vicomte. That's actually how Le Nôtre and La Quintinie know each other, by the way. Because I forgot it. Well, I'll talk about that another time. Anyway, if I go up on the top right-hand corner, look at the building in the back. Many of you have seen it. Absolutely. C'est les Tuileries. Huh? It's the Grande Galerie des Tuileries. There were fruit and vegetables in the Tuileries garden. Who knows that today? Underneath is something you may not know, and I hope you will get to know it better, because it's the garden in which the 6 of us who are here today work. It's the Potager du Roi. An image about fruit, about stocking fruit, about the fact that La Quintinie always says, and this is very much linked to something John was saying earlier. In the 17th century, one had pyramids of fruit on tables. And La Quintinie says, I prefer baskets that come back empty, that pyramids come back without being eaten. And part of the problem with what's happened in the 20th century is a lot about eating on sight, eating by sight, rather than with one's mouth. And La Quintinie insists that things have to taste good, not necessarily look good. Once I've said that, I should tell you that this question of visual appreciation obviously exists in the 17th and 18th century. It's not just us. It was also a problem back then. This is what most people know about La Quintinie. It's about pruning trees. It's It is very important, and the major thing that he does discover or show is the difference between fruit buds and wood buds, so that you can shape your tree knowing whether you're going to have a branch or whether it's going to flower. And I will try to avoid talking about that. Again, we'll have to come back, Christian, for another talk about fruit pruning. I'm getting to the end of the historical before we go on a tour of the garden, but I have to do one more thing about who is La Quintigny and about what this garden wants to be. When La Quintigny goes on son grand tour, when he takes a student to go to Italy, and he comes back, and that's how he knows Fouquet, and that's how he meets Le Nôtre. Tombono is the son, with the name of the family for whom he's being professor, and Tombono is one of the friends of Fouquet. And Tombono house is actually the model for Fouquet's Vaux-le-Vicomte, with the same architect, and with Le Nôtre as the gardener. And so he meets them just before Vaux gets built. But more important than what I just said is something I've repeated twice that I try to subliminally influence you with. La Quintigny is a teacher. And he writes a book called Instruction. That's my first step in what I'm trying to say. Let's do the next one. Well, no, I forgot, I put something else in. I get parentheses and parentheses. This is just to remind you that logos, the idea of a trademark, exists in the 17th century, and we're already talking about the Sun King. This is the image I really wanted to show. This is a very identifiable space today still in the kitchen garden. It is the image which the book begins with, and I want to do a zoom. Again, it's half a postcard size. And I'm going to do the same thing I did with you on the other one, and this time you're not allowed to answer, because you got it already right once. What's interesting about this image? Anyone have an idea? And the gardeners aren't allowed to answer either. It's three details. There's only one person wearing a hat. There's only one person wearing a hat. And let's just stay with the person who has a hat on. And he's tasting something. Again, another image of somebody tasting in this book, so that when we're talking about gardening or kitchen gardens or farming, we always have to talk about tasting. If we don't do it, we're not doing it right. Why do we know he's the king? Because he's the only one who has a hat on. And if you're king, you're the only one allowed to have a hat on. Everybody else has to take their hat off when they're there. How do we know who is giving him fruit? Yes, we know who's giving him fruit because it's La Quintigny's book, fine. But there's a detail about that person. He has a sword. In other words, he's also been anobli, how do you say that in English? He's been ennobled, thank you. But more importantly than that, I want to go back to what I talked about Louis XIV initially, and I forgot to tell you something, as usual. Let me go back one. We are in a very identifiable place of the garden. I forgot to tell you what its name was. It's called the Figgery. And La Quintigny says he's very proud of this building, that this is a new thing. This is something that he created, nobody else has ever done, to grow fig trees as if they're orange trees. I like coal, so I won't complain. It's called the Figgery. So obviously it's La Quintigny offering a fig to the king. But I want to remind you of what I said before. Two things that I said before. First of all, the king's not just the king. He's all of a country. And second of all, La Quintigny is not just a gardener. He's a teacher. In other words, he's offering his book to the king. He's offering his book to France. This is a garden that was meant to be a school from its inception. That's all I wanted to say. That was a long story, just that phrase. A school. So I told you that's my punctuation. So here we go for a flash tour around the garden. I came with 2 gardeners, 2 students, and a landscape architect of our school, but I want you to see some of the other faces, and I hate garden pictures without people in them. So here's 2. Harvesting asparagus in the spring. I had to come up with that in English. Harvesting asparagus in the spring is David. Trellising peach trees in the spring, and that's very important, and I promised myself I would not go off on this. We don't prune our stone fruit in the winter. So we trellis after they flower, then we prune. Again, that's the other talk, or another one.
Green harvesting?
Is that?
Green
It would be, it's what we call green pruning, at least in French, but you might call it green harvesting in English. Yes. So we're starting in the spring. The peach trees haven't flowered, but the asparagus is already up. I hope you don't get angry at me. There are pear trees flowering, but you do see plastic. And I think we'll talk about that at some point. What is authentic? What is growing a garden the way it should be? What are the stakes? And I'll try to answer that, but not on my whirlwind tour through the garden from spring to winter. Actually, I should have put the peach tree before the pear tree in terms of flowering dates, but just some of our shapes. When we do pruning, when we want to get the full shape on a horizontal branch, you have to take off the flowers from the end so that so that the tip keeps growing. But you have to do something else. Can anyone tell me what else you have to do? Because once you know those two things, you've understood everything. You have to keep the tip of the branch up, because otherwise it stops growing. See, wasn't you, Cole, this time? It's very simple to prune trees. A lot of people think it's complicated. It's very simple. Just think of it as plumbing with a certain form of apical dominance. In other words, it always wants to go up. And if you don't respect that, you stop. So that's Sebastian, who doesn't work in the garden anymore, and Alejo, who's Argentinian and who came 3 days as a volunteer and then ended up staying for 5 months as a volunteer. And I wanted to mention that we do take volunteers. This is Mathias. We don't very often have naked soil in our garden. We try to avoid it. You don't say naked soil in English. Bare soil. I think that was going to give me off on another attack. I'll say it anyway. Sorry, and I hope I'm going to excuse myself to all the people who don't appreciate what I'm going to say. If you meet a gardener who doesn't talk sex, it's not a gardener. Because that's what gardeners do. And I don't mean just talk. What they do is they manipulate the sexuality of plants and animals. That's what they spend their time doing. So if you don't hear sex talk from a gardener, something's wrong. Here we're just asexually reproducing potatoes. In this case, there's a very close link to the history of the garden and sexual reproduction. So a small collection of strawberries. The most important one is on the lower right-hand side. It's called Le Fraisier de Versailles. Okay? And it's very important because it created a debate in 1762 between the person who had it, whose name was Antoine Jacobsohn, and Linnaeus. So Linnaeus thought that species were fixed. That doesn't sound right in English. Anyway, that species didn't change. I was thinking about domestic animals. Species don't change. And here's a guy who he's 17 at the time, who's growing strawberries just in a garden just by the kitchen garden, who's the son of someone who works in the kitchen garden, who comes up with a strawberry that doesn't have 3 leaflets, but 1. And he writes to Linnaeus and saying, "You're wrong, species change." I will not go off on this too much because that's another talk. I've written things about strawberries. Peaches. We have lots of different peaches in the garden. The one on the left is a 17th century. The one in the middle is a 20th century selected by the gardeners of the kitchen garden. And on the right-hand side is an industrial peach, commonly used for canning, which is terrible when canned, but great when fresh. When will they learn to transform fruit properly? Small collection of, I should tell you how many fruit we have. We have 468 fruit varieties in the garden. We don't have the 7,000 apple varieties. We only have about 160 apple varieties, about 140 pear varieties, about 35 plum, 24 fig, and some of those numbers might be wrong, but I know it's 468 in all. Keep going. We don't just do fruit. We have lots of different vegetables, about 300, depending on how I convince Christine, who's with us here today, or how we interact and how much work she thinks will fit in. We have between 300 and 400 vegetable varieties per year. We have a collection. We don't conserve the seeds, we buy our seeds. We try to buy them from people that we like, sometimes seed savers in the States. We do that because part of our income is from production. And we went to visit Monticello, and they seem to have quite an income from their seeds, but we have a real demand for fresh vegetables, and so fresh fruit and vegetables, so we concentrate more on production than on seeds. We'll get around to it maybe if we get more land one day, but then it won't be the same kitchen garden. This is Christine and Mathias harvesting our squash. We divide our production between, how to say this, between production and between collections and production. So we have spaces in which we trial things, and we have spaces in which we produce as much as we can. This is part of our pear collection. On the upper left-hand corner, that's Le Petit Muscat, dit Sept en Gueule. I always like that name. It's called Seven in the Mouth. So in principle, you can fit 7 of them in your mouth at once. That pear is our earliest fruiting pear. Depending on the year, end of June, beginning of July. On the lower right-hand corner, we have one of our latest pears, which is more along the lines of November, December, that we keep through. Well, we usually eat it before, but it could keep through March. Whoops. Again, not just fruit, we also are very interested in root vegetables. We're very interested in root vegetables both for the symbolic content and for its practicality. Symbolic content is a joke I have, which is saying that we've lost our roots. And I'm actually rather serious about that, in the sense that we've stopped eating roots because roots are natural storage items. And we don't need that anymore because we bring things in from further away. So we don't store things the same way. But roots are meant. Humans use roots as storage. Plants use them as storage too. That's the whole point of the tuber. In this particular case, it's something that most of you know, but you've never seen in this shape. It's a nasturtium, but it's not the same species as the one that you know the red or orange flowers for, which you can eat. I hope most of you know that. It's a tuberosum. It's the Tropolium tuberosum. So same genus, but not the same species. This is my favorite picture of Christine. I've shown you at least 2. She's in the back here. I don't know if she appreciates my showing her, but she's in this picture. She's facing La Cantini. We are, La Cantini doesn't write this, but I know there's another author in the 17th century who says that the best fertilizer for a garden is the owner's eyes. So he's there all the time. Some other quick moments around the garden before I get to some of our other reasons, though this one mentions some of our problems to come, talking about the walls. But we have wonderful light, wonderful passageways. We have a whole series of different sets of trees. We used to have 68 different fruit tree shapes. For the moment, we're down a bit because we've lost a few. I will talk about that in just a moment. That's my transition coming up. This is probably our symbol. I noticed that John chose it as well, used it as well. But I can't see that without thinking gardens don't exist without people. It's people who make gardens. Nature doesn't make gardens. And I do like showing Julie, who is probably our best fruit pruner, and I do like her black fingernail polish. I forgot to put my punctuation in, but that's a punctuation note. So we're going to change topics. Gardens aren't without people. Schools don't exist without people. This is a collection, so to speak, of some of the more important people who teach at the Landscape Architecture School. This man is currently teaching at Harvard. I'll show you over here too. He's teaching at Harvard. But the person I would like to show most is on the upper right-hand corner. His head is in the leaves. I imagine that there's several people who recognize who he is, and in particular Cole and Christian, but maybe others. His name is Gilles Clément. Interestingly enough, I don't think he should be known for his gardens as such. I think he should be known for what he writes, and for the fact, for a few phrases actually, written in the late 1980s, early 1990s. And again, I'm trying to do that transition thing, so I've gotten you to the right point. Gardens don't exist without people, but gardens are defined by the fact of being closed, of having a wall around them, being a limited space. And what Gilles Clément wrote late 1980s, early 1990s was, if that's the definition of a garden, well then our planet is a garden, because it's closed. It's no longer something where even those spaces that are wild have become enclosed, and we're occupying all the rest. And in any case, if we consider the world to be a closed space, and we consider that gardens are necessarily cultivated by people, well then we are responsible for our planet. It's a school. All those teachers are there for all these people. And one of the things that we're working on this trip is the relationship between what's going on in the classrooms and what's going on outside. And I think we haven't done it right yet. I'm not going to tell you it's right. I'm going to tell you we have to keep on working on it. We have to do more trips like the one we're doing between gardeners and landscape architecture students so that they learn from each other about what's happening. They spend a lot of time in classrooms. Sometimes they go outside. But most of the time when they go outside, it's to draw or to walk, which is important. I would like them to go outside and garden a bit more, so I won't show you any images, even though they do it a little bit. But I'd like them to garden more. What they do go outside for is to learn about soil. And for our soil specialist, I want to point out something I mentioned before that I want to come back to just briefly. It's built on a swamp. What do you do when you build? I'll change my story, actually. And I'm going to do this side for a moment. What happens if I dig a hole? What do I have if I dig a hole? This is my question to know whether you're a potential landscape architect or not. What do I have if I dig a hole?
Inside to the layers of the soil.
If I dig a hole, I have a mound. Now, why do I have a hill? So just before I mentioned that we had a swamp. Just further before that, I said that it was Orangerie, place Pièce d'Eau des Suisses, place Potager du Roi. When they built the Pièce d'Eau des Suisses, they built it to drain the swamp. And since they weren't any dumber than we are today, they took the soil and put it where the kitchen garden is. So that actually the kitchen garden is 182 centimeters higher than the space was in the 17th century. And the reason I'm saying that here is that they did a lot of it with sand, because part of that was sand, and that's why he's extracting so much sand. It's kind of strange to have sand, that kind of quantity in that space. But there's a whole layer of sand. We have real problems with water, with the water table. That's for another day, and I already went off track anyway. They go out in the garden to see soil. We also do fun things in our garden. This is a sculpture that we built with an artist to talk about composting. It doesn't work as a composter, but it has the shape of a mushroom. And we were trying to get people to see that there were mushrooms going on in there, and for it to look good. And we had a lot of fun with it. People really liked it, and explaining that it didn't work was also a way of getting them to do it right. Errors are, in some sense, are necessary sometimes, and they're sometimes a better way of getting the right result than doing it right away, though I do prefer getting it right away. This is another sculpture. We have every year in September, we have a contemporary art festival. It's linked to the school, of course, but it's also linked to the idea that this garden was modern. So if we only do old things, we're not doing what they would have done. We do both. We have contemporary art festivals. We also have traditional exhibitions. And I think I show you at some point, yes, just a little bit further on, some images of some of our events that are sometimes contemporary and sometimes about traditional things, for example, like eating. Punctuation mark. How much time have I taken? I don't even know. I'll keep going. And I have to get to the end anyway, otherwise I can't stop. This is where it gets difficult for me and maybe for you. A school that has lots of underground spaces that people don't see, that have to be paid for, that have to be, how do you say that? Je voudrais dire entretien, mais they have to be maintained. There we go. Have to be maintained and sometimes have to be restored. This is the main space for working for the people who do most of the vegetables. It leaks. It doesn't necessarily have all the amenities one should perhaps have. It's also a good representative of how, hey, why didn't it change here? Whoops. John, we have a little problem here. Where are you?
John?
Now it's gotten discombobulated because I have this image here and a different one over here. How am I going to do this? Let me try one more time once around. Hey, we have the same one on each side. Okay, so let me try going back once. There we go. We're in the underground passage. What I want to show you is we have lots of underground passages. I got it. All that's orange is underground. that people don't see. It's a garden meant to be in the sun, but we have passageways for gardeners, for storage, and for lots of different things that are underground that people don't see and that still need to be both maintained and in some cases restored. Let me give you an example of something that's happening right here. I'll show it over here in this space. That there's a huge empty space underneath there. That's actually what I was just showing you before. That's the main area for vegetable preparation, and it's been that way since the 17th century. Keep going, I want to show you some other problems we have. It was built on a swamp. They put in big drainage, a real aqueduct, real drainage system that today still pumps out in the summer 15 cubic meters of water a day from our 22 acres, and in the winter 25 to even 30 cubic meters a day. But we still have drainage problems in the garden. Let me show you and I forgot to tell you this too. The diagram I just showed you was drawn up by the students who are with me. I should have, I now have said it. So this is our drainage problems. Let me show you what it looks like when we're in the garden. It's, this one you can't see, this one you can see. We'll have to make it darker next time. It's all the blue spots where we're having drainage problems. You kind of see it here, but there's also here. There are other spaces that got a bit clearer. John had the same problem with one of his images as well about the brightness. It's a map showing where we are having waterlogging problems. The other day we made a hole and we had the water table at 35 centimeters down. Our roots are there, and so we are having some root asphyxiation. Let's go on with another problem that we're having. I like this photograph. I think it's a great demonstration of how the garden functions aesthetically in terms of you're on one level, you have a terrace above it, but you also have a view through to another garden that's beyond it, and you have a door to your right. But I do not see the same things in this garden as most of our visitors. And one of the gardeners here, François Xavier, always tells me I shouldn't say this. I don't see the same thing as other people in this garden. I see my problems. He says, no, you should see our possibilities. And yes, I see the potential, but I see our problems. I see a wall that's crumbling that has no trees on it. I see a foundation here that really has to be redone, and people are walking and trucks are passing. Yeah, so yes, I see the potential, but I also see the problems. That's a map of all the walls and all the spaces that need to be replanted in terms of trees. It's quite a bit. I haven't finished yet. We have walls that have fallen down. This is in 2014. It hasn't been rebuilt yet. We're working on that, and I'm going to talk about that in the next section, so don't get too upset yet. Let me show you, that's one problem. Walls falling down, we have two of them. Whoops. We also have walls that aren't falling down, but that need to be redone. And it's very important to me to talk about this. And I'm happy I'm in New York City right now, and I'm not in France. I'm going to say something that I probably wouldn't say as openly in France. I actually had an architect come to the garden and say, why don't you just pull the tree off, redo the wall, and push it back up? Okay. I just wanted to say that. That was my that was my moment. I think some people might understand that. Let me show you a map where I've accumulated all our problems. We're a garden that needs to be restored. That's a lot of a garden to be out, and this is the same garden you saw those pictures of. Okay, so we're successful at taking pictures that look good, even though the garden needs work. So let me try to explain how we got there. And this is the part that's difficult for you. It's easy for me, but it's difficult for you because I'm not going to show you many beautiful pictures anymore. Or at least what I think are beautiful. The garden was created in 1678, or starting in 1678, and for about a century, it became a model for European aristocratic kitchen gardens. And I'm not the one who says that. A guy called l'Abbé Pluche says it, a guy called l'Abbé Valmont says it, and Voltaire says it. They all say this in the beginning of the 18th century. So I'm just repeating something that they said. This is a garden that was a model for others. For those of you like Christian who know Versailles very well, the date of 1782 is significant for lots of different reasons. But essentially, it's the date starting at which, 1782, 1784, the park gets replanted. Because gardens, parks, do have historical cycles. And Christian points it out in his book about Le Trianon, Le Hameau de la Reine. most historical gardens have centennial cycles. It's linked both to trees, it's linked to the history of walls. Walls need to be restored between 80 and 120 years, depending on how they're built. It's what happens. So, first 100-year cycle, the garden changes enormously, and it goes into a second cycle, 1782 to 1874. The Potager du Roi goes back and forth between supplying the king or the Restoration or the Second Empire, or being a school, because during the French Revolution, a school is installed in this garden, and then closed, and then reinstalled in 1848, and then closed. And since 1874, the third period that opens, it has been under the responsibility of a school. Somebody asked me, you, Andrea, why it was not part of the palace, and why it's separate from the palace. Well, for the reasons I've just described, because for the past 140 years, it's been under the administration of a school, and this school's been under the tutelle, administration of the Ministry of Agriculture, while the palace is underneath the Ministry of Culture. There are huge advantages, and there are huge disadvantages. The big, huge advantage is that we really do get to do what we want to do without having a huge administration telling us what to do. The huge disadvantage is we don't have access to the same kind of donors. Since 1995, I should do something about the 19th century still, 19th to 20th century. The Potager du Roi was the main French horticultural school. Everybody knows it as l'École nationale d'horticulture, but I want to insist that a good part of the school was a landscape studies program, including in 1874, and that those people who were redoing Paris, who had been redoing Paris during the Second Empire, so Alphand, Édouard André, pardon? Well, he was the general administrator, but he wasn't the gardener. The people working on the gardens was really Alphand, and I'm getting Alphand, Édouard André, there was the way, Barrier Deschamps was the one I'm looking for, who did Les Buts de Chaumont. They all taught at this school. Since 1995, it's open to the public. It was not open to the public before, and it is the historical site of a school, and I'm reading this, that questions the future of landscape in a context. Is that with an E in English? No. That's French. In a context of climate change and the search for sustainability. That's what I'm going to try to talk to you about now. But how to do it? How to get everybody on board? How to try to give you a greater understanding of what our ambitions are. We want to share the atmosphere. We want to share what's going on in this garden with as many people as possible, and insist on the fact that it only exists because gardeners continue to work there. We want to remind you that plants are living, that our environment is living. And so yes, if it's a heritage, fine, but it's a question of taking care of it. If we can't make our historical heritage transition to sustainable practices, how can we get our society to transition? And so rather than thinking only about new spaces, about new gardens, about new companies, I think we should really think about how we get the old to become today, to become even tomorrow. And in the case of the Potager du Roi, that's about food and health. My sister's here, I said that the 5th time or 6th time, but we're highly influenced in my family by my mother, among other things, my father as well, and lots of other people, but food and health issues. I was lucky enough to have a mother who brought me around and made me taste things all the time, even if I didn't want to. And I realized that tasting has a lot to do with health. Being aware of how your body reacts to something is fundamental to remaining healthy. And what we're trying to do in terms of sustainable practices and food and health issues is to try to create an agroecological system which isn't based on using medicine. One tries to be healthy without medicine. One takes medicine when you're sick. You don't plan on being sick. So our current agricultural practices, and that's what John was saying, are based on the idea that we continuously treat, we continuously medicate. Can we try to create a system which medication is used, but it's not, your health isn't based on it. It's based on healthy practices, prophylactics, and taking care of oneself. Once I've said that, I want to insist on the fact that we're a public. We're open to not just open to the public, we're publicly owned, and we have a role, we must not just respond to what we're asked for, but try to provide something that sometimes we're not asked for. I can't sell much cardoons. We haven't stopped producing them. because maybe one day somebody will like them and make them popular again. We want to position this school and this space, ENSP is École Nationale Supérieure de Paysage, as an incubator for desirable spaces, and we want to start it with how we redo this garden. That's why I'm on a trip with students. And you know, I entered this garden some 14 years ago on a 3-month contract. And I didn't really care about landscape architects. Sorry, Christian. I didn't really even know they really existed. I was interested in fruits and vegetables and eating, sometimes a tractor or a combine harvester. And I hope you don't mind that I'm going to say this, and sex. But anyway, and I've learned that in some sense the engineer that I am or that I was can give lots of solutions, can come up with lots of ideas, but basically, in terms of our environment, in terms of our society, there has to be a spark of creation. And I think that landscape architects can bring that. They have to interact with gardeners, they have to interact with the rest of society, but landscape architects are somewhere between technicians and artists, and that's something that I think is fundamental, and that in our school and in our garden, we want to defend. So how do we do that? We're going to do it with 4 strategic axes. One that's about heritage conservation and restoration. One that's about finding the right practices in a site that's open to the public. John showed an image earlier of people medicating plants. I would like you to know that in our garden, we have not used any herbicides since 2012. We haven't used any chemicals since 2013. We have stopped all, and I say chemicals because for me, how to say, oui, bon, it is. Sulfate de cuivre. Copper sulfate is a chemical. So I think people should be, you know, I don't want to get into a debate about this. I got myself into trouble already by saying this. We've stopped all spraying on our fruit trees. We do no longer spray our fruit trees at all. We have lost 60 to 70% of our production. And we have killed a few trees. But we are working on which trees survive, which shapes function, which varieties are doing better than others. And if we don't do it, nobody else does. So we're getting there. That's the kind of thing. And why do I say that? We're open 7 days a week to the students. How do you spray? Let me keep going. Involving visitors. I said I'd mention other things. We do a food festival. We do a theater festival. We do a contemporary art festival. We do music in the garden, harp. We have a wonderful harpist who comes regularly. We do exhibitions. We have symposium. In fact, at this moment in Versailles, there's a symposium about trying to think of the circular economy in terms of landscape. Somehow or other, I can't get over this, and you know, I ran away from school. I tried to, I liked school, but I didn't want to teach. I ended up in a school anyway. And somehow, it seems appropriate because the people who have influenced me most sometimes were teachers, but in any case, they were people I learned from. So for me, teaching, research, and creation go together. They're linked necessarily to people. On the left-hand side of the screen, you have a panel. In their first year, all the students have to go interview gardeners, and they have to do a panel that describes one part of the garden. On the right-hand side, this is about creation. We had a student who won a prize and did a comic strip about the importance of landscape architects in terms of conceiving large cities. And so that's her, she drew herself leaning against a railroad tracks. Like I said, this is the difficult part. It's not easy to keep myself going, and I'm starting to tire. Landscape plan for 22 acres, yes. What we're doing is we came up with a kind of program. And this is what the 2 students and the 2 gardeners are working on with Sylvie, who's in the back. We have to try to make entering this site simple. People understand. It's an incredibly complex garden. 22 acres. You know how many site names we have in this garden? How many names we have for different spaces? Oh, I'll put it differently. Just for the central square, which is 7 acres, okay? Just for that central square, we have 24 names for different spaces. And it goes around the whole garden that way. It's a very complex site. How can we get it less complex? How can we find ways of putting what's necessary to cultivate in spaces that can look good? How can we take into account how visitors discover, how they move from one space to another? How can we remember that students and teachers and artists aren't going to do their thing in the same place every year? We have to include all those things, and that's what the two students, the two gardeners, and Sylvie are working on in part. We made a map for them. We said, this is your program, because we know certain things about this garden. We know that we want the school to be everywhere. We know that we need a visitor center. We don't have one. We know that we have to make production, what's necessary to produce visible. For the moment, it's hidden. You don't know where it is. And at the same time, I think that's a definition of sustainability, that you can't see something without knowing how you got it. Or to put it differently, it's a Wendell Berry phrase. Eating is an agricultural act. You have to know that when you eat, you're having an effect somewhere else. The heritage axis and the event axis are linked to the fact that those parts of the garden, there's one part of the garden, the heritage axis, which has been least changed. It's the most true to the 17th century. In fact, there's one garden in the middle, here and here, which has been continuously cultivated in more or less the same way since the 17th century. So we would like to maintain that. On the other end, the event is the furthest away from the city, that's been the most changed. It's where we can make the most noise. So it's a good place to have a party. We've been thinking about this for a while, and in February 2017, we sent off our application to be part of the World Monuments Fund watch list. I don't know if you know the watch list, but the watch list selects between 25 and 50. Lately, they've been really reducing it to 25 sites in the world for a 2-year period that they feel, World Monuments Fund, need to have special attention. It can be something destroyed in Syria for political reasons. It can be something destroyed in Haiti because of a hurricane. It can also be a building in Buffalo, New York that needs to be remodeled. And in this particular case, they said yes to the Potager du Roi because of this idea, I think at least, because of this idea that sustainability is not just about what's new or how we do things newly. It's what we do with what's old. How do we bring it into our 21st century? Those are some dates about what we're doing to go along with the World Monument Fund, because on Saturday, June 16th and Sunday 17th, in principle, I'm supposed to send this landscape plan to them, and we're going to make a party out of it. But it's not because we're doing a landscape plan that we stop. We still have to get things done. We still have to garden. We still have to start restoring certain spaces. On the left, a building I successfully didn't show you during the pictures. On the left, its current state. On the right, what it will look like in about a year. We're trying to use the vocabulary with the architect whose name is Alexandre Chemetov, who we hoped would be coming with us, but wasn't able to. We're trying to use the vocabulary of greenhouses, of this 1930 building that's hidden in the garden. And it's going to become part of, it'll remain a building for teaching, but it will also become part of our event space. And it will host, in May 2019, what Versailles hopes to be its answer to the Vienna Architecture Biennial. I couldn't resist this because I've been talking about the King's Kitchen Garden, and King's Kitchen Garden, but I do want you to know that the school isn't only in Versailles. It also has a building, an annex in Marseille, which is the second biggest French city, in which architecture, urbanism, and landscape architecture are all in the same building. This is a building that has not yet been built, but what I'm very proud of in terms of this building is that some of the students I've worked with are the ones who are designing the landscape architecture space around it. But it's also part of the school. Here it is again, in its urban context, in its royal urban context. In the case of a school, with that original plan, but this time I couldn't resist. The students did a wonderful thing I want to show you, because somehow or other it's going from this to this that we're trying to do. We're trying to make it new, to make it new, we have to rethink about it, we have to project, we have to imagine. We're not just imagining, if I dare say, it's a bit pretentious, but I'll say it anyway. We're not trying to just imagine the future of the King's Kitchen Garden. We're trying to imagine the future of our world. What world do we want to live in? Thank you for listening to me, and I'll try to answer your questions without rambling. Yes, I have a question here.
Can you comment on sustainability in the 17th century?
I was talking about that with John. So the question was sustainability in the 17th century. How can I do this without rambling? First of all, it didn't exist. So we can apply the concept. We can try. We've been talking a lot about this on this trip. Really a lot especially with François Xavier, but not only. And I'm going to answer by taking a sidestep. We've been to Oak Spring Garden, which was Mrs. Mellon's, Rachel Lambert Mellon's estate. So if you don't know who Rachel Lambert Mellon was, don't worry, but she did design the Rose Garden at the White House. We've been to Monticello, Mount Vernon, just before yesterday we went to Glenstone Museum, created by Mitchell and Emily Rales. We've seen a lot of spaces that take a lot of work, and we're not sure what they produce. The real question around sustainability for me is carbon footprint. How much energy goes in for how much energy comes out? I have never been able to measure the amount of work that went into the King's Kitchen Garden in the 17th century, but let's say 50 to 60 gardeners. How many calories came out? Would they have fed more than themselves? Yes. I think the real question of sustainability today is a question of energy calculation. And I don't know how to do that for the 17th century.
And the plants were coming from all over also.
What do you mean?
The plants, thanks to the marine and everything.
So 17th century is a moment when plants move more and more. And the garden does function as a space for acclimatisation, for acclimatation. So I guess I'm starting to mumble or stammer because there are several questions for me with sustainability. First of all, the scale. What scale am I calculating it on? Is it just the space here? Am I saying it for all of Versailles? Am I saying it for all of France? But it's always a question of energy balance. So if we're bringing new plants in, how many new plants are then being diffused to others? Are they contributing to other places or not? I don't know how to talk about sustainability in the 17th century. What I can say, and I finally found my answer, a far greater circular economy in the 17th century than today. A far more circulation of energy going from the kitchen garden to the palace, from the palace, let's say, to the outhouses, from the outhouses to the manure heap, from the manure heap back to the garden. So we're having a circular economy in the 17th century that we don't have the same way today. You don't say circular economy here?
I would say a closed loop system.
Or closed loop system.
That would have been utilized any time before the 20th century. That's when we really started going downhill in terms of NPK and the utilization of that. So I would say that they had a much more sustainable society in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries.
I hesitate to say it's a more sustainable society, and I'll tell you why. I think that La Cantini in this garden is one of the creators of intensive monoculture. He creates a figgery here, and a melon here, and a plum growing here, and fig growing there, and no rotation. And he says you're going to cultivate those things there for the rest of your life, and you're just going to bring in manure all the time. You're just going to keep on replenishing the soil from somewhere else. So he's really creating monoculture. That's what he's looking for. The society may be generally more sustainable, but behind the idea of what he's doing is our modern problems.
How did his practices compare to those more generally across the country?
In the 17th century, I sometimes think of La Cantini as the director of the biggest experimental site of horticulture in the 17th century. So he's diffusing information and he's receiving information. I mean, people are always, you know how information gets centralized? So all the information goes towards him, and all the information gets diffused by him. He says specifically that he's learned most of his vegetable growing techniques from market gardeners. He avoids saying that he's learned most of his grafting techniques from peasants because he doesn't want to admit it. But we do have some information about that elsewhere. He is courtisé, he's courted by the King of England who wants him to cultivate in England. And he regularly sends melons. I think we have an image of the 17th century as more disparate. I think it's rather, things are traveling very quickly. I'll give you one example that's before the 17th century of how quick things go. Christopher Columbus, 1492. 1505. Squash is in Spain, Loire Valley, Vienna. It goes very quickly. Thank you for the translation. The people, they offered it to each other. In fact, thank you for that idea. How do things happen? Well, people travel. Sorry for the noise. People travel, and in those days you never traveled without seeds. When you come in by plane from anywhere else into the States, I have to do another one first. Okay. When you travel into the States, you're not allowed to bring seeds, so we try to avoid bringing seeds. But that's how everybody traveled. Everybody brought seeds with them. So what we did is we brought some of our jam with us to give to Christian. And we also do things that they may not have done the same way in the 17th century. Offering jam, by the way, is a typical diplomatic cadeau, gift in the 17th century. It's an anecdote, but here it goes. Sophie de Hanovre is the mother of the King of Germany, King of England. She's from Hanover. And for different reasons of succession, it's the Hanoverian family, which is today, I don't know if you know that, the royal family of Britain is actually German. In any case, she goes to Versailles incognito because she doesn't want affairs of state. But she has to offer something. And she has to be offered something because even if she's incognito, she still is the mother of the King of England. She offers jam from her garden, and she gets offered jam from the kitchen garden. Merci, Christian. But in any case, it's travelers. They go with seeds all the time. There we go.
That's why we have dandelions. No?
I do not know how dandelions travel by humans, but I do know how the wind takes it. Yes?
What are the other outlets for the produce? You hinted at it in the talk.
Who do we sell our fruit and vegetables to? That was a resume. Let me give you some numbers to begin. We used to produce about 30 tons of fruit. We're down to about 15, but we're 10 to 15. We're going back up, but we're having problems with birds. We produce between about 20 tons of vegetables. That sounds like a lot, okay, but it's not. When you divide that into 50 weeks of being open, it comes out about 40 tons. It comes out to, 400 kilos? I'm getting this wrong. 800 kilos a week? 800 kilos a week. I mean, we're not feeding that many people. We sell to everyone who wants to come by. And we sell also to 5 other, and you're giving me a good opportunity. We have a few partners. We sell to 2 restaurants that are one that's within 300 meters of our place, and one where the chef lives 150 meters away from us. And so that when he gets up, he goes to his place anyway, and he takes our produce with him. We sell to a caterer, because we both want to be very local, but we also want to attain other people. We want other people to know we exist. So the caterer is a very interesting way of doing that, and it's not somewhere where people have to go. It's someone who goes to you. And our caterer is called Cuillère d'Argent, Silver Spoon. It's a well-known name in the States. And it's a woman who works with she does very expensive prepaid lunches for large companies. And so we have a little flyer, and mostly our herbs go along with those things. And I'm going to put my speaker down to get something else out to do another partner. We also work with a company called Nina's, which has existed since, I always have to look it up, 1678, sorry. No, that's us. Where's her, well, I can't find her date. It's a company that specialized in extracting aromas and in perfumes in Versailles, not only in Versailles, since the late 17th century. We sell them apples, they extract the apple aroma, and they aromatize, you say that? Aromatiser? And they aromatize tea, chocolate, soap with our apples and some of our roses. I can't resist. But I haven't finished yet. We also recently got involved with two young, with a young couple who wanted to do a startup, who walked into the shop one day and said, "We have an idea, but we don't want to tell you what it is until you say yes." That was rather difficult as situations go. But they explained little by little, they got around to their idea. They wanted to find 17th century recipes for beauty products and use only those things that exist around Versailles to make them. So this is something you can go home with. We now have beauty cream made with, whoops, no, pass it. Beauty cream made with, for you, with the rosemary from our garden, based on a recipe from the 16th century called the L'eau de la Reine de Hongrie, but made into a cream. And we're starting a new one with them that's using cucumbers, because you think cucumbers is a thing for beauty products today, but no, it was also in the 17th and 18th century. And they even developed specific cucumber varieties for the cosmetic product, because they wanted cucumbers that were white. So when you see white cucumbers, they're actually not so much for their taste, they're because they want them to be white for the skin. So we're also doing that with them. Why would we do cosmetic products? Actually, it's the same thing that I was trying to talk about before, because it might seem a little bit far from gardening or from food, but it's not really. It's about taking care of one's environment, it's about taking care of oneself.
So I was going to ask, Louis XIV clearly benefited enormously from his peasants who were there to work for him, and you clearly benefit enormously from your volunteers. But very often, Anglophone gardens depend on smaller volunteers, like rabbits. I wondered who you shared your produce with, and whether you have a Mr. McGregor.
You may not like what I'm going to say. We don't like Peter. I'm Mr. McGregor. Although Mrs. Mellon really liked Peter, but anyway. When the students tried to bring in some rabbits in the garden, we ate them. We do not want rabbits in the garden. On the other hand, when that happened, the students got smart and they built a hen house. So we do have hens. And we, as I often say to some of the gardeners, when you cultivate potatoes, you also cultivate Colorado potato beetles. And when you cultivate pears, you also cultivate scab. That's part of it. Getting the right equilibrium is what it's about.
So, in that, you said you have you've stopped using, let's just say, toxic chemical applications, etc. Have you supplemented anything with biological infusions or anything like that to take place of plant health in relation to that?
I'm going to answer. I really have to learn to give simple answers. No, but let's think about that for a moment. It's one of my comments about, it's trying to think about food. Isn't it better to try to feed properly rather than to depend on dietary supplements?
Yes.
So the idea for us today is to see if we can feed them properly. Our plants feed ourselves and our earth properly, which is not a refusal of dietary supplements. but we have to see where we need them before simply doing it. The problem with most dietary supplements, infusions, compost tea, nettle tea, I mean, it has to do with the fact that it has a large spectrum of activity, and we have to try to find which ones could function. That's the positive answer. The negative answer is rather difficult to say and rather difficult to be responsible for. One of the reasons we don't do any spraying, two of the reasons we don't do any spraying is work time and public presence. It's not that we don't want to sometimes, it's that we don't have the time, or when we could do it properly, people are present. Not easy to deal with. I think I'm working with some of the gardeners on trying to see if we can separate some spaces in the garden that we don't let people into, but we've never done that. We've always let people everywhere.
There's not an issue with those type of applications?
No. Well, we have to be careful. There's a lot of legislation on this, so that some products yes, some products no. I should add.
My products.
Well, wait a sec. If I do compost tea, it's considered what the French call compost tea, so on va dire un purin d'ortie. It's comprised in a certain category of product, maybe not a medical product, but it's as a product, and I could have a 6-hour or a 12-hour limit before letting people in. By the way, I should add something to this, because I think that's one of the things that you're asking that maybe isn't clear. When I say we don't spray, I don't say we don't use any medical elements. We do use on our tree. First of all, I said that I didn't do any sprays on the trees. I didn't say we didn't do any sprays on the vegetables. And on the trees, we do use confusion sexuelle. We do use pheromones to confuse some of the insects so that they don't reproduce. And we do insect traps, but it's not a spray. And on the vegetables, we did use last year, or last vegetable year, so to speak, we did do 2 BT for Colorado potato beetle, and we did do 1 bicarbonate to try to slow down mildew on tomatoes.
I'm not speaking of that. These are all soil drenches to balance the soil nutrient cycling capacity. That's what I'm talking about.
Okay, now I understand. We're not doing any bone or other things for the moment. We are in the process of working with it's just started. It took a while to get going. We are working with a soil laboratory that's linked to the National Institute of Agronomic Research, but we don't have the money to do the work yet, but at least we have the researchers who are willing to try to look into the history of our soils and to do a certain number of tests in terms of biological activity. We haven't financed it yet, but we at least have the researchers who are willing to do it.
That's another question.
Absolutely. I'm up for questions. Though actually, Christian, I don't know how you want to do it. Do you want people to drink? Or not to drink? Okay.
What is the overlap with what you're growing today in terms of types of plants with what was grown in the 17th century?
Oh, I like that question.
And do you have any cultivars growing today that you suspect were all grown that far back?
I like this question because it allows me to talk about sex all the time. 2 things to begin with. As usual, I always find 2 to begin. Lacantini writes that the real profession of a gardener is always to do new things. That's what a gardener is supposed to do, always do something new. What we try to do in this garden is try to keep the older cultivars that we find most interesting and to continuously add new ones. So we have a collection of about 100 old fruit cultivars, and we have a collection, or 200, it's about half and half, a little bit less on the older and a little bit more on the 19th and 20th century cultivars. So we have quite a bit there. On vegetables, and why do I like to say that this is about sex? Because on trees, on fruit, it's easy and I find uninteresting. It's all asexual reproduction, it's grafting. In principle, you're faced with the same, in principle only, you're faced with the same exact fruit, the genetic equivalent, except that, as I hope some of you know, fruit trees in general have a tendency to mutate all the time, so that they're not identical to each other. Even on a same tree, you can have branches with different genetic makeups. So trees are uninteresting to me because it's all asexual. Vegetables, on the other hand, are all about sex. And that's what I like about them. Think about cabbage. I can keep a cabbage seed anywhere between 2 and 6 years before germination rate goes down. So generally, we reproduce them every 2 years. That means 50 sexual generations per century. We have varieties in the garden, in particular, le chou milan des Vertus, which is known from the early 17th century, which is partially mentioned by La Cantini. It's had, let's say, 300 sexual generations. Well, maybe not. 250? Is it the same plant? It's the same name. This is maybe an exaggeration, but I'll use it anyway. How similar am I to my 250th person behind me? Relative. It's not quite the same with plants because their genetics aren't quite the same, but just the image. So yes, we have varieties from the 17th century. We try to add new varieties all the time. That's the whole idea of what I was mentioning one time, the difference between collections and producing. You haven't gotten thirsty yet? I mean, can I give another hint? Yes.
He wants us to take a break.
That was a nice way of saying. I can keep going, by the way. Let me show you something else. It just so happened, this is a rather funny story, and I guess this will make a good transition for you, Christian. There's an article in this book written by the 2 students who are with me. It's not really a book, it's a magazine, and it's in French. I have 1 copy for Christian, but I think he has it already, and I have 2 copies for those of you who are francophones and who would like one.
The good news is I talked to Sylvie in Paris, and she's going to do a kind of English translation now.
So you're going to have an English translation soon. But more importantly, there'll soon be an article on this studio. Any last questions? I've exhausted you.
Thank you. It was great. Thank you very much. So now, I hope you're going to, I'm sure you're thirsty, so please.
This is not very
yes,
nice, what I'm gonna
no,
do.
yeah.
I just realized
Oh,
John
no.
had a sheet for himself. For his
Yes, yeah, no, yeah, me too, I realize that. Kind of shocking, yes.
Just for those of
All
you
right.
who knew, you maybe knew, but they didn't.
But you know, that's, yes, that's John, you know.
Actually, one more thing for
Yes,
me.
please.
I do want to say, I'm finally getting around to being polite. I really want to say thank you for all of you coming, and I want to make a grand merci à Christian Duvernois for having received us. It was just a mail I sent him one day, and he said yes. So, and thank you to you, Jared, and to the French Heritage Society. I'm going to let Elizabeth Stribling have the floor, so to speak. Something that Elizabeth Stribling doesn't know yet that's about French Heritage Society is that one of our students here, in the back with his jacket on, actually was part of the exchange program.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elizabeth Stribling, and I'm very happily the American chairman of French Heritage Society. And just to let you all know, in this room, we send American students each year to the Potager du Roi, and it is a marvelous experience. And these future gardeners, paysagistes, are going to come back to the United States with these old techniques or very, very modern techniques. And we, besides restoring buildings of beauty all over France and French inspiration in the United States, our student education is essential to us. And I know we're all Francophile, if not Francophone, here today. And I try to be both. But I think this is just marvelous of bringing France back to America and American ideas to France. And I want to thank everyone at the École for welcoming these lucky students. And we do have one here today. Christian? Christophe? Would you mind just coming up and telling in 2 sentences, 3, what you did at the potager?
Okay, so we are two here landscape students, and we are here for 4 years, and so we are now at the end of the 4 years. We are landscape architects, and so we take a little part of the everyday life of the kitchen garden of the king, but we are almost doing a big study on landscape on different scales. So it's garden scales to territory scales, and then what could I say more? Oh yeah. Yes, and thanks to French Heritage Society, we made an exchange with different parts of USA garden. Like in Charleston, there is a magnolia plantation where I've been for 2 months to do a garden work, like a gardener, and it was amazing, an amazing journey. So that's it, and thank you.
We need some beauty product.
If you let me talk, I'll talk all the time. I wanted to add that so there are 5 to 6 students every year from the landscape school who go to the States, and at the landscape school we receive 2 landscape architecture students from Cornell University every year. So that's part of our thing. And since Elizabeth Stribling mentioned that, I will mention something that is also due, and that's actually partially how I know Christian Duvernois, is we, and John mentioned it actually incidentally, we every year, it's been 3 or 4 years now that we have a program with Youth Build Louisville, Kentucky, where we receive generally four inner city young adults from Louisville who come from food deserts and who come work in our garden they work in the garden 8 days and they are on vacation for 5. And so we bring them around and we do lots of things with them. And it's a wonderful experience. In fact, Christine is one of the people who takes care of them most. Christine et François-Xavier, à vous maintenant. You have to come up here. Allez, il faut venir.
It's a great success because I talked to some of them and they totally transformed, by the internship. Thanks to you, and thanks to Antoine.
One of the things that really surprises me every time, well, François-Xavier a bit less, but Christine, is that we've all gotten used to them coming every year. And so my gardeners, so to speak, the gardeners I work with haven't learned French that much, but sign language is incredible. Some of those things about getting things done, they've got it down. They now know how to get certain things done just with their hands. And it's actually a wonderful moment both for them, but they ask me when are they coming, when it's going to happen. Even though it gives us extra work, it's something that goes well. Merci.
Thank you.